Hello again. In this video, we are going to talk about conflict theory. We're going to review what conflict theory is in brief and also talk about how do we apply it to social problems. So, conflict theory or social conflict theory, you can use those names interchangeably. I'm not sure which one your instructor that you had for Intro to Sociology used, but they mean the same thing. I have a tendency to say conflict theory, and it means the same thing as social conflict theory. So, in review, this is a macro scale way of looking at social structure and analyzing social structure and macro scale patterns in society as though they are designed to give benefits to the same group of people over time and create disadvantages to the same group of people over time. And so you find in conflict theory, you find key terms like social resources or raw materials. You have the concepts of the haves versus the have-nots, a very general concept that neo-Marxists use to apply to any opposing factions in society or categories of people who have opposing interests. But in conflict theory, traditional conflict theory, classic Marxism is traditional conflict theory. It looks at capitalism as the source of the worst kind of inequality in society. And so Karl Marx focused on the class distinctions between the capitalist class and the working class, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie were those who owned all or controlled all of the means of production and distribution. You can call them industrialists, you can call them capitalists. In fact, in a lot of his writing, it was capitalist class versus working class or proletariat. Workers only owned their labor, and if you are an unskilled worker, you can't sell your labor for very much. And Karl Marx's idea was that capitalists constantly tried to pay you less and less for your labor and used you as though you were just property to own, as a means to get profit. And so this was where the source of conflict or struggle, class struggle in society. Often, Karl Marx explained that workers often felt alienated and alone instead of banding together to have class consciousness so that they could overthrow the few people who were in power and change the system. And so conflict theory at its core is something that doesn't just try to identify inequalities in society. It tries to stamp out those inequalities in society after they are identified. So some of the things that a conflict theorist would identify as social problems, perhaps a functionalist would not identify those as a social problem. Functionalists identify social problems and agree that they must change in order to keep society stable and orderly. A conflict theorist would look at any situation with haves or have-nots and say that we need to get rid of that inequality. So classically in Marxism, with the capitalist or industrial economy as the villain, anytime there is a corporation or any part of industry or modern economy that is perceived to disadvantage workers or to keep the 1% in power compared to the 99% powerless among us, then that would be the source of the social problem if you took a classic Marxist approach. So for instance, one of the things that Karl Marx wrote about with Frederick Engels, his comrade in these efforts, one of the things he wrote about was the problem with organizing the nuclear family in Western culture. He cited the nuclear family as a direct social problem related to the way the economic structure was composed, because he said in the nuclear family, the idea was to work to improve the situation that people had, work to own property, and pass that property down from one generation to the next. and therefore that created a hold on some of the resources that were available in society. And once one family got a hold of this, or just a few families got a hold of this, he said over time the bourgeoisie would control and own everything, and the rest of us would just essentially be in the worker class. The proletariat would just essentially be like serfs. And so he saw the nuclear family in general as a problem that kind of propped up the capitalist system. And so those kinds of things that he wrote about in his lifetime, and that Frederick Engels continued to write about after Karl Marx died, those kinds of things are part of what you would identify still today. If you used this classic point of view as a conflict theorist, you would identify those things still today as social problems and try to stamp them out. Neo-Marxists look at a broader swath of society, not just economic trends. So neo-Marxists look at any two groups that you can identify as haves or have-nots. You can look 100 years ago when women were fighting for the right to vote, and a neo-Marxist would say, okay, voting rights, that was the social problem that kept the haves in their position and kept the have-nots in their position. And so, the struggle was there. They fought for legislation, and now females have the right to vote. Okay, so any opposing categories of people, maybe it's opposing belief systems. So for instance, Muslim versus Christianity. These have opposing belief systems, and historically and currently, these opposing belief systems cause conflict, cause wars, like literal conflict, wars, not just, the dynamics of, the current of class struggle in society, but literally combat these things cause. And so the neo-Marxists take this classical Marxist view. Neo, of course, means new. And so neo-Marxists take the classical view and broaden it so that it includes way more, depending upon what issue you're looking at, we could talk about a variety of people being the haves, not just the capitalist class being the haves, and not just the workers being the have-nots, but anybody where there's unequal amounts of rights, access, privileges, or any kind of opposing forces. Gender roles, for instance, if females are, and feminist theory. Feminism is a classic conflict theory branch that you can apply to classic Marxism or neo-Marxism. So classic Marxism, of course, let's look at the domestic function of a female traditionally in society, and therefore how does that translate, if at all, and it does, to the pay that a female gets in the workforce, or what kind of jobs are open for females in the workforce, and that kind of thing. Or neo-Marxism with feminism, you would look at something like voting rights, ownership rights. Females didn't always have the right to own property in Western culture. We do now in other societies, such as Muslim cultures throughout the world. Not all, but a lot. Females still don't have the right to own property. They rely on a son or a male relative for their care and that kind of thing. So neo-Marxists will focus on other issues other than merely economic ones to identify and focus and try to fix social problems. And so there is conflict theory in a nutshell, and we have another theory to examine together, symbolic interactionism, a microscale theory that we will do in our next video. See you there.